Captain Jiho Kim's boots touched the strange surface of the alien world, and he immediately felt like he was walking on diamonds. The ground beneath him sparkled and made soft musical sounds with each step, as if the planet itself was singing. He had traveled billions of miles from Earth, farther than any human had ever gone before, and now he stood on a world that looked like it came from a fairy tale. The air around him shimmered with colors that didn't exist on Earth. Purple mixed, with silver and golden light danced through the atmosphere like living ribbons. Jiho had seen many beautiful things in his life, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from pure amazement. This was why he had become an explorer, why he had left everything behind on Earth to venture into the unknown. The palace in front of him made Earth's greatest buildings look like children's toys. It rose so high into the sky that the top disappeared into the clouds, and its walls looked like someone had captured lightning and frozen it in place. The structure pulsed with soft blue light, and Jiho could see energy flowing through it like blood through veins. Every few seconds, bright flashes would race up the walls, creating patterns that were both beautiful and impossible to understand. As he walked closer, the massive doors opened without anyone touching them. They moved silently, revealing a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were covered in moving pictures that showed scenes from across the galaxy, distant stars, colorful nebulae, and worlds he couldn't even imagine. Some of the images showed the history of the Velthara people, beings who had lived for thousands of years and had powers that seemed like magic. Jiho's footsteps echoed in the vast space as he made his way toward the throne room. He had studied everything Earth scientists knew about the Velthara, but seeing their world with his own eyes was completely different. These beings didn't just live on their planet, they were connected to it in ways humans couldn't understand. The very air seemed to respond to their presence, and the ground beneath his feet felt alive. When he finally reached the grand hall, Jiho stopped breathing for a moment. The room was bigger than any stadium on Earth, with a ceiling that looked like it was made of captured starlight. Floating crystals provided gentle illumination, and the walls showed moving images of distant galaxies. But none of that compared to the figure sitting on the throne at the far end of the room. Queen Mireille was unlike anything Jiho had ever seen. Her body seemed to be made of light itself, shifting between solid form and pure energy. Sometimes she looked almost human, with features that were achingly beautiful. Other times she appeared as a swirling mass of colors and light that hurt to look at directly. Her presence filled the entire room, and Jiho could feel her power like electricity in the air. When she spoke, her voice was like music itself. "Welcome, human ambassador," she said, and the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We have been watching your species for some time. You are interesting. Most races we encounter are either too primitive to notice or too advanced to care about anything beyond themselves. But humans are different. You reach for the stars even though you know how small you are." Jiho straightened his shoulders and tried to look confident, even though he felt like a mouse standing before a goddess. This was the moment that would determine the future of both their species. Queen Mireille raised her hand and the entire room fell silent. Even the floating crystals seemed to dim their light out of respect. Jiho watched as she began to speak, in a language that sounded like singing, mixed with the whisper of wind through leaves. He couldn't understand the words, but somehow he felt their meaning deep in his bones. This was how the Velthara had conducted ceremonies for thousands of years, long before humans had even discovered fire. The queen's form began to glow brighter, and she reached into what looked like empty air. Her fingers seemed to pull at the very fabric of space itself, and slowly, a perfect sphere began to form in her hands. It was no bigger than a baseball, but inside it, Jiho could see what looked like a miniature star. Light swirled and danced within the sphere, creating patterns that were hypnotically beautiful. The object pulsed with energy that made the hair on Jiho's arms stand up. "This is compressed starlight," Queen Mireille explained, her voice filled with casual power. "A single drop of a dying star's last breath, captured and condensed. Your scientists would call it impossible, but for us, it is a simple gift." She extended the sphere toward Jiho, and as he took it, he felt warmth that seemed to reach into his very soul. The weight was surprising. It felt heavier than it looked, as if it contained more than just light and energy. Jiho's hands trembled slightly as he held the sphere. He knew that what he was holding could change everything for humanity. The energy contained in this small object could power every city on Earth for hundreds of years. It could end energy shortages, stop wars fought over resources, and push human civilization into a new golden age. And to Queen Mirae, it was just a casual gift, something she had created in seconds without even thinking about it. Around the throne room, dozens of other Valthara watched the ceremony. They were all beautiful in ways that hurt to look at, their forms shifting between solid matter and pure light. Some looked more human-like, while others appeared as geometric patterns of energy that moved through the air like living mathematics. Despite their incredible appearance, Jiho noticed something in their expressions that surprised him. They looked bored. These beings had seen this same ceremony play out hundreds of times before. Primitive species would arrive, offer their greatest treasures, and receive gifts that were beyond their wildest dreams. To the Valthara, it was routine. They had met civilizations that could travel between stars, species that had unlocked the secrets of time itself, and races that had built cities inside black holes. Humans were just another curious species that had managed to crawl out of their home system. Now it was Jiho's turn to give his gift, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a mountain. He had trained for this moment for years, studying Valthara culture and practicing diplomatic protocols until he could recite them in his sleep. The Earth delegation had spent months deciding what to offer these godlike beings. They had selected the rarest metals from Earth's crust, elements that were supposedly unique to their planet. They had compiled humanity's greatest scientific discoveries, hoping that their knowledge might be valuable to such an advanced civilization. But standing here, holding a sphere of compressed starlight while surrounded by beings who could reshape reality with a thought, Jiho realized how foolish those preparations had been. What could humans possibly offer to creatures who had mastered the universe itself? Their metals were common elements found on a million worlds, and their science was like showing cave paintings to Renaissance masters. Jiho's heart was racing as he stared at the diplomatic pouch containing Earth's official gifts. The rare metals and scientific data suddenly felt like toys compared to the compressed starlight still warm in his other hand. He could already imagine the polite but dismissive reaction from Queen Mirae and her court. They had probably seen the same kinds of offerings from countless other species, precious materials that weren't really precious, and knowledge that was elementary to beings who had mastered the cosmos. His hand started moving toward the pouch, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the bored expressions on the faces of the Valthara courtiers, or maybe it was the way Queen Mirae seemed to be waiting for yet another predictable display of primitive offerings. Whatever it was, Jiho felt a sudden urge to do something completely different, something that would surprise these ancient beings who had seen everything the universe had to offer. Without really thinking about it, his hand moved to his jacket pocket instead. His fingers brushed against something small and familiar, a worn little book that he had carried with him on every important journey for the past 10 years. It was his grandmother's recipe book, filled with her careful handwriting and stained with decades of cooking adventures. He had brought it with him to space not as a gift, but as a reminder of home, something to comfort him during the long journey to this alien world. The book was nothing special to look at. The cover was faded blue cloth that had seen better days, and some of the pages were loose from years of use. Yellow stains marked spots where his grandmother had accidentally dripped sauce while cooking, and the margins were filled with her personal notes about adjusting recipes for different family members. "Add extra garlic for Jiho," one note said. "Less salt for grandfather's blood pressure," said another. As Jiho's fingers closed around the little book, he could almost smell his grandmother's kitchen. He remembered coming home from school to find her bent over the stove, stirring a pot of soup with one hand while writing in her recipe book with the other. She would test every dish multiple times, making tiny adjustments until it was perfect. Not because she was a professional chef, but because she wanted her family to taste love in every bite. The book contained more than just recipes. Between instructions for making kimchi and notes about fermenting vegetables, his grandmother had written little stories about her life. She wrote about surviving the war, about raising children during difficult times, and about finding happiness in small moments. "Food is love made visible," she had written on one page. On another, "The secret ingredient is always patience, even when the world is falling apart." Jiho pulled the book from his pocket and looked at it for a moment. It seemed so small and insignificant in this grand hall, filled with beings who could manipulate matter and energy like gods. But something deep inside him knew that this was the right choice. Earth's metals and scientific data were just things, but this little book represented something much more important: the human spirit, the ability to find joy and meaning in ordinary life, even during the hardest times. "Your Majesty," Jiho said, his voice stronger than he had expected, "I offer you something different." He held up the small recipe book, and he could see confusion flicker across the faces of the Valthara courtiers. They had probably never seen such a humble offering in their ancient throne room. Queen Mireille's form shifted as she reached for the small book, her hands solidifying just enough to hold the fragile paper. The moment her fingers touched the worn cover, something strange happened. A ripple of energy passed through her entire being, and for just a second, she looked completely solid, completely real. The other Valthara in the room noticed this immediately, exchanging glances that spoke of surprise and confusion. The queen opened the book carefully, as if she understood how delicate it was. Her eyes, which sometimes appeared as points of light and sometimes as something almost human, moved across the first page. She could read the human writing instantly, her advanced mind translating the Korean characters without effort. But what puzzled her wasn't the language. It was something else entirely. The writing felt different from anything she had encountered in thousands of years of studying alien civilizations. "Kimchi recipe for winter," she read aloud, her voice carrying a note of wonder that hadn't been there before. "Add extra love when the weather is cold, because hearts need warming too." The queen paused, her form flickering more rapidly now. "What does this mean? Love is not an ingredient. It cannot be measured or added to food." The Valthara courtiers leaned forward slightly, their own curiosity awakened by their queen's unusual reaction. In all their long lives, they had never seen her respond to anything with genuine interest. She was always composed, always in perfect control, always slightly distant from everything around her. But now she seemed engaged. Jiho watched the queen turn page after page, her luminous eyes scanning recipes for soup, notes about family gatherings, and little drawings his grandmother had made of vegetables from her garden. The book contained decades of his grandmother's life, written in her careful handwriting during quiet moments, between cooking and caring for her family. Each page told a story not just of food, but of love, patience, and the simple joy of feeding people you cared about. "Tell me about this grandmother," Queen Mireille commanded, but her voice was softer now, less like a royal decree and more like a genuine request. The change in her tone surprised everyone in the room, including Jiho himself. Jiho took a deep breath and began to speak about Grandmother Yunji. He told the queen about a woman who had lived through war and poverty, who had raised 6 children, in a tiny house with barely enough food to go around, but who had never let hardship steal her joy. He described how she would wake up before dawn to prepare breakfast for her family, humming old songs while she worked. How she would save the best pieces of food for others and claim she wasn't hungry when there wasn't enough to go around. She used to say that cooking was like magic, Jiho continued, his voice growing warmer as he remembered. Not because the food would taste amazing, though it always did, but because it could bring people together. She could take the simplest ingredients, just cabbage and salt and thyme, and turn them into something that made the whole family gather around the table, sharing stories and laughing together. Queen Mireille's form continued to shift as she listened, becoming more solid with each word. The other Valthara watched in amazement as their queen displayed something they hadn't seen in millennia: genuine emotional response. Her energy patterns were changing, becoming more complex, more alive. The queen turned to a page where Grandmother Yunji had written about making soup during a particularly hard winter. "The children were sick and we had no money for medicine," the note said. "But I made soup with extra ginger and told them stories while they ate. Sometimes the best medicine is just knowing someone cares enough to spend time making something special for you." The grand throne room emptied as Queen Mirai dismissed her courtiers with a simple gesture. The floating crystals dimmed to a softer glow, and the moving images on the walls slowed to a gentle drift. For the first time since arriving, Jiho found himself truly alone with the most powerful being he had ever encountered. The silence felt heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the weight of secrets about to be revealed. Queen Mirai stood from her throne and walked toward him, her form becoming more solid with each step. By the time she reached him, she looked almost human, though her skin still held a faint luminescence that reminded Jiho she was anything but ordinary. Her expression was unlike anything he had seen from her before, vulnerable, almost sad, as if she was about to share a burden she had carried for far too long. "What I am about to tell you," she began, her voice quiet now, "no other species has ever learned. We have kept this secret for millions of years, hidden behind our power and our perfection." She paused, looking down at the recipe book still in her hands. "But your grandmother's words, they have awakened something in me that I thought was lost forever." Jiho waited, his heart pounding. He could sense that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything he thought he knew about the Velthara and their magnificent civilization. "We are not gods," Queen Mirai said simply. "We are prisoners, prisoners of our own perfection." Her form flickered, showing glimpses of the swirling energy beneath her human-like appearance. "Long ago, we were much like your species. We felt joy, sadness, love, anger. We created art and music, told stories, and dreamed of impossible things. But as we grew more powerful, as we learned to manipulate matter and energy, something terrible happened." She moved to a window that showed the crystalline landscape of her world. Everything was beautiful, perfectly arranged, but Jiho suddenly realized it was also completely static. Nothing moved, nothing grew, nothing changed. "The more perfect we became, the less we felt," she continued. "Immortality meant we had forever to experience everything, but when you have forever, nothing feels special anymore. Unlimited power meant we could have anything we wanted, but when you can have everything, nothing brings joy. We achieved transcendence, but we lost our souls in the process." Jiho stared at her in disbelief. "But you're incredible. You can create starlight, manipulate reality itself. You've built a civilization that spans galaxies." Queen Mirai turned back to him, and for a moment her eyes looked completely human, filled with an ancient sadness. "Yes, we can do all of that, but we cannot write a single new song. We cannot feel the warmth of friendship. We cannot experience the simple pleasure of a meal shared with loved ones. We exist, but we do not truly live." She opened the recipe book again, running her fingers over a page where Grandmother Yunji had written about making birthday soup for her youngest grandchild. "When I read this, I felt something I had not experienced in eons. Your grandmother wrote about staying up all night, stirring the pot and adding ingredients, not because the soup was difficult to make, but because she wanted it to be perfect for someone she loved. The effort itself was the gift." The Queen's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her form becoming more solid. "We have studied thousands of civilizations, watching them evolve, waiting to see if any would break the pattern. Every species that achieves great power eventually faces the same choice, transcendence or mortality. And every species that chooses transcendence ends up like us, empty, perfect, dead inside." She looked directly at Jiho, her eyes now completely human and filled with something that looked like hope. "But humans are different. Your species has something we thought was impossible, the ability to create genuine novelty even in the face of cosmic insignificance. You know you are small, you know you are mortal, yet you still choose to love, to hope, to find joy in simple things." Queen Mirai barely left her private chambers for 3 days straight. When servants brought her the usual energy crystals that sustained the Velthara, she waved them away without looking up from the small recipe book. She sat curled in what looked like a throne made of crystallized light, but her posture was completely unlike the regal bearing she had always maintained. Instead, she hunched over the book, like a student studying for the most important exam of her life. Jiho had been given quarters in the palace, and he could see the queen's chambers from his window. Every time he looked, she was in the same position, her form growing brighter and dimmer as she read. Sometimes she would hold a page up to the light, as if trying to understand something beyond the words themselves. Other times, she would trace the handwritten letters with her finger, her energy form flickering with what looked like concentration. On the second day, something remarkable began to happen. The queen's constantly shifting energy form started to hold its shape for longer periods. Where before she had been like liquid light, flowing and changing every few seconds, now she would maintain a solid appearance for minutes at a time. Her features became clearer, more defined, as if she was learning how to be physical again after eons of existing as pure energy. Minister Tae-hoon, the queen's oldest advisor, watched these changes with growing alarm. He had served the royal family for over 2,000 years, and he had never seen anything like this. The Vailthara had achieved perfect control over their forms through millennia of evolution, but control meant stability, predictability. What a case he was witnessing looked dangerously close to chaos. On the third day, Queen Mireille finally emerged from her chambers, and the entire court fell silent when they saw her. She looked almost completely human now, with solid flesh and clearly defined features. Her skin still held a faint glow, but she was more real than any Vailthara had appeared in living memory. Even more shocking was the expression on her face. She looked curious, engaged, almost excited about something. "Jiho," she called out, her voice carrying a warmth that made several courtiers step backward in surprise. "I need to understand something your grandmother wrote. She mentions chasing chickens in the garden, and then says it was the best afternoon of her life. How can chasing farm animals be the best of anything?" Jiho couldn't help but smile as he remembered his grandmother telling that exact story. "She was trying to catch a chicken that had escaped from the coop," he explained. "But every time she got close, it would run in a different direction. My grandfather came out to help, and soon my mother and all the neighbors were involved. It turned into this ridiculous chase scene with everyone slipping in the mud and laughing until their sides hurt." As Jiho spoke, something incredible happened. Queen Mireille began to laugh, not the polite, controlled sound that royalty might make at a formal gathering, but genuine, uncontrolled laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her. The sound echoed through the throne room like music that hadn't been heard in centuries. The effect on the court was immediate and dramatic. Several courtiers actually stepped backward, their own energy forms flickering with what looked like fear. Minister Tae-hoon's face showed an expression of pure horror, as if he was watching his beloved queen transform into something monstrous before his eyes. "Your Majesty," Tae-hoon said, his voice tight with concern, "perhaps you should rest. This behavior is most unusual." But Queen Mireille ignored him completely. She was too busy asking Jiho more questions about human life, about families and daily routines, and the million small things that made existence meaningful. With each answer, she became more solid, more real, more alive. The meeting took place in the deepest part of the palace, in chambers that hadn't been used for centuries. Minister Tae-hoon had chosen this location carefully. The walls here were made of pure crystallized energy that would block any attempt at surveillance, even by their queen's enhanced abilities. 12 of the most powerful Vailthara nobles gathered, in the shadows, their energy forms flickering with anxiety and fear. "What we are witnessing is unprecedented," Tae-hoon began, his voice barely above a whisper. Even here, surrounded by loyal conspirators, he was afraid to speak too loudly about what they were planning. "Our queen is exhibiting behaviors that go against everything our civilization stands for. She is becoming primitive." Lady Haiwon, the Minister of Energy Sciences, nodded gravely. Her form was more stable than most, indicating her great age and power. "I have observed her carefully over the past week. Her energy patterns are becoming increasingly chaotic. She displays what humans call emotions, unstable neural fluctuations that we eliminated from our species millions of years ago." "It's worse than that," added Lord Minho, the commander of the Stellar Fleet. "Yesterday, I found her in the palace, gardens attempting to grow something. She was kneeling in dirt, handling soil with her bare hands like a common laborer. When I approached, she told me she wanted to understand how her grandmother's vegetables had grown. Vegetables? Food that we transcended the need for eons ago. The other nobles exchanged horrified glances. The idea of their perfect queen, a being who could manipulate matter at the atomic level, playing in dirt like a primitive farmer, was almost incomprehensible to them. It represented everything they had evolved beyond, everything they had sacrificed, their emotions to escape. Minister Tai-Hoon's form grew brighter with agitation, but that is not the worst part. She has begun asking questions that reveal a dangerous corruption of thought. 3 days ago, she asked me what it feels like to miss someone. Yesterday, she wanted to know about homesickness, the irrational attachment to physical locations that lesser species experience. These are not just questions, Lady Hywan interjected, her voice tight with concern. These are symptoms. The human ambassador has infected our queen with emotional instability. If this spreads, if other Valthara begin to experience these primitive feelings, our entire civilization could collapse back into the chaos we spent millions of years evolving beyond. Lord Minho leaned forward, his energy crackling with intensity. I have already noticed changes in some of the younger courtiers. They watch the queen with what can only be described as curiosity, rather than proper reverence. Some have even begun asking their own questions about human behavior. The contamination is already spreading. The group fell silent as they contemplated the horror of their situation. For millions of years, the Valthara had existed in perfect harmony, free from the emotional turmoil that plagued lesser species. They had achieved true transcendence, becoming beings of pure logic and unlimited power. The idea of returning to the messy, chaotic existence of emotional creatures was their worst nightmare. "We must act quickly," Tai-Hoon declared, his voice growing stronger with resolve. "Every day that passes, our queen becomes more corrupted by these human concepts. She speaks of joy and wonder as if they were desirable states rather than primitive weaknesses. She has even begun to eat physical food, claiming she wants to understand the comfort it provides." "What do you propose?" asked Lady Hywan, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Removal," Tai-Hoon said simply. "For the good of our species, for the preservation of our perfect civilization, Queen Mirai must be removed from power before her infection destroys everything we have built. We will replace her with someone who understands the importance of maintaining our transcendent state." The nobles looked at each other, understanding passing between them without words. They were planning treason against their beloved queen, but in their minds, they were heroes, saving their civilization from destruction. The attack came at dawn, when the palace was at its quietest. Queen Mirai was in her garden, the small patch of earth she had created behind her chambers, where she was trying to grow tomatoes from seeds Jiho had given her. She was kneeling in the soil, her hands dirty for the first time in millennia, when the energy barriers suddenly surrounded her. The air itself seemed to thicken and glow as Minister Tai-Hoon and his conspirators emerged from the shadows. "Your Majesty," Tai-Hoon said, his voice filled with what he believed was compassion, "we cannot allow this madness to continue. You have been infected by primitive emotions that are destroying everything we are. But it is not too late. We can help you return to your perfect state." Queen Mirai slowly stood, brushing the soil from her hands. For the first time since her transformation began, she looked completely human. No glow, no shifting energy, just a woman standing in a garden with dirt under her fingernails. But her eyes blazed with a power that made even the ancient nobles step back slightly. "Infected?" she repeated, her voice steady despite the energy weapons pointed at her. "You think feeling joy is an infection? You believe that caring about something beyond yourself is a disease." Lady Hywan stepped forward, her form crackling with barely contained power. "Your Majesty, please understand. We have observed thousands of civilizations fall to these same weaknesses. Emotion leads to chaos, attachment leads to suffering, and love leads to loss. We transcended these limitations for good reason." Jiho, who had been sleeping in his chambers, was awakened by the energy disturbance. He rushed to the garden and found himself facing a scene that would determine the fate of 2 civilizations. The most powerful beings in the galaxy were having a civil war over whether feelings were worth having. "You want me to choose?" Queen Mirae said, looking at each of the conspirators in turn. "Return to the cold perfection we have known for eons, or continue down this path of dangerous emotions. You believe this is about weakness versus strength, chaos versus order." Minister Tehun nodded eagerly. "Exactly, Your Majesty. We can reverse this contamination. You can return to being the perfect ruler you were meant to be, free from these primitive human impulses that serve no purpose." Queen Mirae picked up the recipe book from where it lay beside her newly planted tomatoes. The pages were slightly damp from the morning dew and some soil had gotten on the cover, but she held it like it was the most precious object in the universe. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "This is about choice, but you're wrong about everything. Else, these emotions you call weaknesses, they are what make existence meaningful. This attachment you fear, it is what gives life purpose." She looked at Jiho, and her expression was filled with something the Valthara had not seen in millions of years. Genuine affection, the kind that came from truly caring about someone else's well-being. "I have lived for countless eons in perfect, empty harmony," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I have commanded the forces of creation itself, bent reality to my will, and achieved everything your definition of perfection could offer. And in all that time, I have never felt as alive as I did yesterday when my first tomato sprout pushed through the soil." The energy barriers around her began to fluctuate as her power responded to her emotions. But instead of the wild, chaotic force the nobles expected, her energy was becoming more focused, more purposeful than it had ever been. "I choose to feel," Queen Mirae declared, and as she spoke those words, her form became completely, permanently solid. The transformation sent shockwaves through the palace, and something extraordinary began to happen throughout the Valthara Empire. The moment Queen Mirae made her choice, something incredible happened throughout the palace. The energy barriers that the conspirators had erected began to flicker and fade, not because they were being destroyed, but because the Valthara maintaining them were experiencing something they had never felt before: doubt, curiosity, and the first stirrings of emotions they had forgotten existed. Young courtiers who had been watching from the shadows began to step forward, their own energy forms starting to stabilize. A junior minister named Seonho was the first to speak, his voice filled with wonder. "Your Majesty, I felt something when you chose to remain solid. It was like waking up from a dream I didn't know I was having." Minister Tehun backed away, his form flickering wildly between energy and matter. "No, this cannot be happening. We are witnessing the destruction of everything we have built, everything we have achieved." But even as he spoke, his own voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. More Valthara began to emerge from their hiding places throughout the palace. They came in small groups at first, then in larger numbers, all drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Some were curious about the garden Queen Mirae had created. Others wanted to understand why their perfect queen was crying over a tiny plant sprout. None of them had experienced curiosity in millennia. Lady Hywen, who had been one of the strongest supporters of the coup, found herself staring at the small tomato plants with an expression of fascination. "How long does it take for them to grow?" she asked, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "Months," Queen Mirae replied, wiping tears from her eyes, tears that sparkled with the last traces of her energy form. "You have to water them every day, protect them from storms, and hope they survive. There's no guarantee they'll make it, but that's what makes each tomato precious." "But why?" Lady Hywen asked, her form beginning to solidify as she spoke. "Why care about something so fragile, so temporary?" Queen Mirae smiled, and the expression transformed her face completely. "Because caring about fragile things teaches us what strength really means. My grandmother spent hours tending her garden, not because she needed the vegetables, but because watching something grow from nothing gave her hope during the darkest times in her life." As the days passed, the transformation spread throughout the Valthara Empire. Those who chose to embrace emotions found their energy forms stabilizing, becoming more human-like, but retaining their incredible abilities. Those who rejected the change remained as they were, perfect and empty, But they found themselves increasingly isolated as more of their people chose feeling over perfection. The palace gardens became a gathering place where Valthera came to learn about human concepts they had never understood. They asked Jiho about family, about friendship, about the strange human habit of keeping pets not for any practical purpose, but simply for companionship. Some of them began attempting to create art again, producing the first new Valthara music, hands over 1,000,000 years. 3 months later, Queen Mireille stood in her garden holding her first ripe tomato. It was small and slightly lopsided, nothing like the perfect specimens the Valthara could have created with their matter manipulation abilities. But as she bit into it, tears streaming down her face at the simple pleasure of taste, she understood something profound. "Your grandmother's greatest recipe," she said to Jiho, who was helping her harvest the vegetables, "wasn't for food at all. It was for hope. She taught me that the universe's greatest power isn't the ability to manipulate matter and energy, but the courage to care about something small and fragile even when you know it might not last." As the sun set over the transformed world, painting the sky in colors that the Valthara were truly seeing for the first time in eons, Jiho realized something that would change how humanity saw itself forever. Their gift to the galaxy wasn't their technology, their ambition, or their ability to explore the stars. It was something much simpler and much more powerful: their stubborn refusal to let suffering destroy their capacity for wonder, their determination to find joy in small things, and their courage to love even when love meant vulnerability.